This is a PowerPoint to help you revise for the National 5 English Paper 2 exam if you are studying Sailmaker specifically. The PowerPoint will compare the text to the video game Cuphead to show you how approaching the 8-marker question specifically is like approaching the final bosses in a range of video games. Cuphead is my particular example this time, but the same would apply for Super Mario Brothers, Crash Bandicoot, you name it. As long as it's a platformer, the general approach would still apply. The aim for this is for you to develop your approach to make sure that it is consistent for whatever 8-marker question appears in the final exam. For reference, I will be using the SQA question from the 2022 paper, which is readily available online, and I'll put a link in the description below. So to begin with, here is the question. It comes from Act 2 of Sailmaker on the lines which are described. Again, there is a link in the description below, which will take you to the specific paper in question. But if you are looking at the book rather than the past paper, then you want to be finding the lines where Ian enters and asks how the exam was, all the way down to Ian saying there's always cricket, and then he does the mimicking of the cricket bowler. Our question is, by referring to this extract and at least one other part of the play, show how the character of Alec is presented. So the first stage of the 8-marker question is a phase called commonality. This is worth 2 marks as a maximum. And in order to approach this, you need to do 2 things. So you need to say 2 things that are true in relation to the question. In other words, how is Alec presented in the play? Lay your answer out in bullet points, 1 bullet point worth 1 mark. So you're sending a message to the person marking your paper that you think whatever I'm writing next to this bullet point should be worth 1 mark. If it were me, I tend to make the first bullet point based on what I can see in front of me in the exam. You don't have to do it this way, but I think this is the easiest way to frame it. So I would say something about the way that Alec is presented in the extract that I can see in front of me. I don't need to specify that it's from the extract in front of me. I can just say that Alec is presented as. And then I might make a second bullet point about how he's presented either earlier or later in the play. It is possible to say 2 ways in which Alec is presented in front of us. Indeed, in the extracts, there are a few things that we could say about Alec's character. But by splitting the commonality between what I can see in front of me and what I know from elsewhere in the play, this is going to help frame my answer for later. So the big thing that you need to remember about this section is that you need to say 2 things that are true. Take a moment to think about that before moving on to the next slide. So here is an example answer, and this is exactly how I would lay it out in the exam. I would create a subheading, which would either be commonality or just the initial C, just to remind me which part of the 8-mark question I'm answering. My first bullet point tells me that Alec is shown to lack confidence in his own abilities at times. So I'm thinking, I've literally looked at the top of the extract, and the first thing that Alec has said has made me come to that judgment. Then for another commonality point, I said how in the early part of the play, Alec is shown to have a lot of faith in Davy, a lot of respect for him, if you like, thinking about how Alec admires Davy's skill set and his job, thinks that his dad being a sailmaker is something to really be proud of. So both of those things are true about Alec's character. Therefore, I would expect to get 1 mark for each of those bullet points that you can see. Just like a video game boss, though, the 8-marker question isn't done with us. It's going to come back in a different form. And the form that it takes this time is what we call the extract, so the E section. Again, this is going to be worth 2 marks as a maximum. And our approach here is quite straightforward. we just need to follow a quote and explain approach. The extract is the thing that is written in front of you in the exam. So that's the thing that you'll be able to see. So you will need to say something about the way that Alec's character is presented from the extract in front of you. You're going to get 1 mark for using a quote. So even if you have no idea what the question is really asking you, as an absolute minimum for the 8 marker, you really need to write a quote down. Any quote from in front of you, preferably from Alec in this case, because the question focuses on Alec. So pretty much any quote that Alec says is going to gain you a mark. The other mark comes from explaining it. Take a moment to have a think about how Alec's character is presented here and use the quote and explain approach, and I'll give you an answer on the next slide. So here is an example answer for this section. Again, I would use the subtitle of E or extract and underline it before putting my 2 bullet points down. And for my quote, I've gone with this bit from Alec where he says, English was easy, arithmetic was murder. And I've made this connection to my first commonality point where I said that Alec doubts his own abilities sometimes. So my analysis of this particular quote is, this shows us that Alec thinks that he has not succeeded in the exam because he found the maths exam particularly difficult. Something along those lines. Again, I've used a bullet point to represent each mark that I think that I've gained. So 1 mark for the quote and 1 mark for the explanation. There are quite a few different answers that you could go for here. And again, the mark scheme has been linked in the description below. So you'll be able to see a few examples of things that you might have said. If you're unsure at all, of course, then you should get in touch with your English teacher or tutor, and they will advise whether they would have given the mark or not based on your answer. So now that you've defeated the first 2 phases of our 8 marker question, our 8 marker question comes back at us with a 3rd and final phase, much like most final bosses of many popular platformer games. This section is one that I call Other, and it's the biggest, and most students find it the hardest section to answer from, but don't be put off by the number of marks, because like most video game bosses, once you know the strategy of beating them, it does become more straightforward the more you practice it. So again, this is worth 4 marks in total, and the approach that you need to take is as follows. First, you need to make at least 2 points by referring to or quoting. Okay, now I've underlined the word referring there because it would be unreasonable of the markers to expect you to be able to quote from anywhere else at the play. Nobody's going to remember all of the lines of the play other than the actors that are going to be taking part in this. So rather than quoting specific lines, as long as you can refer closely enough to tell your marker which part of the play you're discussing, you will get 1 mark for doing that. However, the quotes and the references have to come from elsewhere in the play other than what has been printed in the exam paper. So think of other as in other part of the play. Again, use bullet points to structure your answer. You previously used 2 bullet points in your commonality and extract sections. For other, you're going to have 4 bullet points in total. You're going to be following a refer and explain approach or a quote and explain approach. So it's quite similar in its layout to extract in that regard. When it comes to looking at mark schemes or indeed your own English lessons, you might hear this being called elsewhere. I call it other because it lines up with my analogy of a video game boss. If we think of the bosses of American companies in particular, they tend to be called CEOs, that is the Chief Executive Officer, which is a fancy word for a boss. So that was how I made the connection here between the 8 marker question and the final boss of a video game. So take a moment now to have a go at this for yourself. Remember, you're going to be writing 4 bullet points following a refer and explain approach. Start by making a comment about how Alec is presented and try to make distinct points. For example, in the early part of the play, Alec is shown to look up to Davy. So I'm making the point that this happens towards the start of the play, and that Alec is quite close to his father, or has respect for his father's profession. This is seen in the way that he believes that Davy will fix the yacht, even though Davy keeps putting it off, is my second point. So this is where I illustrate how, or the reasons why I believe that Alec looks up to Davy. So the repeated discussions about fixing the yacht at various parts of the play. Notice that I've not done any quotes here, because I simply don't need to. If I could remember a quote right now, then I would, but we don't need to do that. We can just refer. And another example, and I'll do these 2 bullet points at a time now. So by the end of the play, Alec is shown to have become distant from his father. And this is shown when Alec and Davy have an argument about Davy's drinking and his general inability to prioritise the things that Alec needs. So again, I've made reference to how Alec is presented, and then I've shown the moment where we could observe that for ourselves, or where the reader could observe that. Okay, so each of those bullet points would be worth a mark each, and at that point you would have got the 4 marks for others. There are many other things that you could say. The 8 marker, the other section of the 8 mark section, if you wanted to, could really go a lot further. But if you've got 4 bullet points, and they line up pretty closely with what I've written on the slide there, then congratulations, you've just got the 4 marks available. If you're unsure, of course, then be sure to show your answers to an English teacher or tutor, who will be able to tell you whether they would give you the mark or not. And there we are. That is how to approach the 8 marker. It is split into 3 sections. Again, the reminder of those titles: commonality, extract and other, or CEO, which is why I call this the CEO approach. Commonality being worth 2 marks as a maximum, extract worth 2 marks as a maximum, and other being worth 4. And if you crack this approach and you do well with the first set of questions, which of course will be worth 12 marks in total, then you'll be well on track to getting a positive result by the final exam. And just as a quick example here, I've taken these directly from the SQA's website, and these are from the mark scheme. So this is for the other section. So as you can see, we can get marks for discussing Alec's grief at the start of the play, for example, and his interest in religion. We could also make a comment about his working class roots and how he aspires for more through his interest in his own education. Those are just some examples there, but that is how it's laid out in the SQA mark scheme, just there with the link on the screen. If you do go to that mark scheme, then you'll be looking for page 12, which is about the 8 marker specifically. And that's it. Now that you've been through this with a guided approach, it's time for you to have a practice on your own. I've taken this particular question from the 2019 paper, and the mark scheme again is readily available on the SQA's website. Have a go at that and try and mark it for yourself. If you're not sure though, then of course make sure to tell your teacher which paper it is from, show them your answers, and they'll be able to advise whether they would have given you the marks that you seek for this particular question. I wish you all of the best of luck with your final exams and for a positive outcome of your National 5 course.